Hello, and today we're going to be focusing on the Ottoman Empire, Japan, and Oceania during the Age of Imperialism. And what we want to do with all three of these regions is take a look at the impact imperialistic policies had on the area and how they changed those three particular regions. And we're going to find that each of these regions have a different impact depending on what's going on. So let's go ahead and get to it. So the first thing we'll do is take a look at the Ottoman Empire. So I'm going to just keep this region by region by region. And my hope is that now that we have China and India in our back pocket, we can start seeing patterns. And we're going to be referencing the patterns as we go through. So for the Ottoman Empire, the biggest challenge the Ottoman Empire is facing is the pressure of nationalism. So this is completely independent of imperialism, really. This is what's going on internally within the Ottoman Empire. And this emerging nationalism is threatening to tear up the ethnically diverse Ottoman Empire. You remember from last semester, the Ottoman Empire was home to several different nationalities, several different ethnicities, several different religions. It was a diverse empire that was held together by this central rule that we call the Ottoman Empire. By the 19th century, this is falling apart. The Ottoman Empire is getting to be known as the sick man of Europe. And this emerging nationalism is showing itself up in revolutions and breakaway efforts throughout the empire. For example, in Greece, there's an effort by the Greeks, and a successful effort, to break away and declare its own nation, independent of the Ottoman Empire, which they succeed in doing by 1832. The same thing is happening all throughout Southeast Europe at this time. But we also see throughout the Middle East Arab groups wanting to break away from the Ottoman Empire and enjoy more autonomy. So I spent a little time on that one because it is a very important feature of this period of time. The Ottoman Empire is struggling to keep the empire together, and different nationalities, in some cases, are breaking off, like the Greeks, or want to break away, like Arab groups all throughout the Middle East. Second, you have another challenge of the influx of cheap European goods. Of course, with industrialization and the increased production of cheap goods, European goods are coming into the Ottoman Empire and underselling local merchants throughout the Ottoman Empire. So, if you're a merchant in the Ottoman Empire, this has not been a good development. The 19th century is a bad time for you economically because cheap European goods are underselling your products. And then the third thing is that the Ottoman Empire has to compete with the imperialistic efforts and the expansionistic efforts of Russia. So in the 19th century, we do see conflict between the Ottomans and the Russians as the Russians start to expand their southern border going into parts of the Ottoman Empire. So the basic idea is that the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century is in a period of decline. It is politically declining from within. It is economically declining because of competition from European products. And it's also getting pressured externally from military forces such as Russia. So, one of the things the Ottoman Empire is going to do is attempt to reform in order to compete and to try and stop this decline. And these attempts to modernize are best sum up with the Tanzimat reforms, which literally means restructuring. So Tanzimat means restructuring. So the Tanzimat reforms begin about 1839, and a series of changes to the education system, to the laws, the legal system, creating equality for all religions, economic practices, an attempt to modernize the Ottoman Empire is underway because of the Tanzimat reforms. And in 1876, a constitution is put into place that is going to increase equal rights for everybody within the empire. It's going to start creating a legislature, independent judiciary branch. It's going to start guaranteeing rights of property and religion to all individuals. And the Constitution of 1876, if you were to read it, you would see a heavy influence of Enlightenment ideals within it. And that's something that we want to keep in mind as imperialism expands. These ideas of imperialism, I'm sorry, these ideas of liberalism, these ideas of the Enlightenment are expanding along with it. Equal rights for all citizens under the law, modernizing laws, separating religion from the state. All of these things are coming together to create an attempt at a more modern state. The only problem with these reforms is that there's resistance from imperial officials because these changes mean a loss of power for the sultan. It means a loss of power for the vizier, for the janissary, all those traditional elites that last semester we identified as the new elites. Now they are the traditional elites. And in the 19th century, they stand a great deal to lose. For example, as public education begins to grow, and the public education is secular, Islamic scholars, the ulama, are going to lose their traditional influence over that institution. So you've got this idea that the Islamic scholars are going to lose their status if these reforms continue. So we see this in China, where imperial officials resisted the self-strengthening movement. We're going to see it here in the Ottoman Empire, and that's going to be a theme that we want to keep seeing. That there's attempts to modernize, but those attempts to modernize are met by resistance from different sectors of the government, usually, that believe that they're going to lose out on this. Now, what eventually happens is this constitution in the 1890s is going to be rejected by the Sultan, and the Sultan is going to carry out a coup, and he's going to kick out a lot of the progressive leaders. This progressive leadership will become known as the Young Turk movement. And what the Young Turk movement wants to do is modernize Turkey, modernize the Ottoman Empire, and make the Ottoman Empire strong again. But they want to do it through modernization and bringing about reforms. So the Young Turk movement, instead of trying to make a deal with the Sultan in 1906, is going to carry out an overthrow of the Sultan. And by the time we're going to leave the Ottoman Empire with a decaying empire, with an empire falling apart from the influences of nationalism, but also run by a group of people who want to modernize and strengthen the Ottoman Empire so that it can become a viable international power once again. Then we're going to look within the Ottoman Empire at Egypt. And I'm going to use Egypt as a particular example of what industrialization and imperialism will do to a region. So in Egypt, Egypt is considered part of the Ottoman Empire, but Egypt historically has enjoyed a great deal of independence. And a leader will emerge in about the early 1800s named Muhammad Ali. It is not the boxer, he's not that old. But Muhammad Ali is going to emerge as the leader of Egypt, the governor of Egypt. And he is going to begin a series of reforms. One of the reforms he puts into place is the development of a Western style army. Egypt, if you don't know this offhand, Egypt was conquered by Napoleon in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. And after Napoleon and his forces leave, Muhammad Ali says, if we're going to compete with the world, we need to have a modern army, not the army of the Ottoman Empire, but rather the army of France, of Britain, of Europe. So he begins a series of reforms to try and modernize the army of Egypt. He's going to send officers off to Europe to study, to learn the tactics of military in France, for example, and to bring those back into Egypt. The second reform he attempts to do is to industrialize Egypt. He starts to bring textile factories and spinning machines powered by steam engines. And his hope is to start competing with England and France on the spinning industry and the production of textiles. He is also going to take more and more control over the production of agricultural products such as cotton and various other agricultural productions or produce like watermelons and fruit and things of that nature. But if we focus on Egyptian cotton, what Muhammad Ali does is he raises taxes on the people to the point that in order to pay their tax obligation, they hand over land to the Egyptian government. And Muhammad Ali is going to use that land and the cotton production to sell it off to the Europeans, particularly to the British, and make profit off of it for himself, for the government. So as a result, we start seeing this relationship form between the Egyptian government and the British consumers. And basically, the Egyptian government wants to sell cotton to these customers, namely European businesses, and they bend over backwards to accommodate the European businesses. Eventually, down the road in Egypt. So here's Egypt modernizing, but it's not quite able to compete with Europe. It doesn't quite reach that level of sophistication. And what ends up happening is Egypt cultivates and grows cotton and sends that cotton off to Europe. And that's the way they're going to make a lot of money. In the 1870s, a canal is built that cuts right through Europe. I'm sorry, cuts right through Egypt. And it cuts from the Mediterranean Sea into the Red Sea. And this is called the Suez Canal. This new canal that connects Mediterranean to Red Sea is a vital trade network now for the British in particular. It cuts down their travels to India significantly. And as we learned from the last lecture about India, India is an important part of of the British economy. So to have this type of access through the Suez Canal is now in the national interests of Britain. And in 1882, there's a rebellion, a revolution, primarily carried out by people who don't like the Egyptian government and how the Egyptian government is cooperating with the West. And in order to protect the Suez Canal, Britain is going to intervene, and then Britain is going to begin the process of colonizing Egypt. So after 1882, what's going to happen is Britain is going to expand its political and economic influence into Egypt because to the British, this is necessary to protect access to the Suez Canal. And as a result, Egypt is going to come under British control. So that's the case of the Ottoman Empire. The second one we want to look at is Japan. Now, we did a little bit of this in the last semester, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going back over it. But the big idea is there are a series of reforms called the Meiji Reforms. And the Meiji Reforms begin 1868 is a good year to use for the beginnings of all of this. The motivations for these reforms comes from the fact that if you guys remember from last semester, Japan had isolated itself from most of the Western world. And under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan in 1853 looked a lot like Japan in 1653. There wasn't a great deal of scientific growth. There was certainly not a great deal of industrial growth. There's 200 years where Japan is relatively stable and there's cultural growth. But in terms of modernizing, it's just not happening. So in 1853, Americans start to show up. And the Americans show up under an expedition by Commodore Perry. And Commodore Perry's fleet is a powerful, actually, it may have been Admiral Perry, is a powerful demonstration of American power. In other words, America is showing gunboats, steamboats, and the Japanese essentially say, we're behind the times. So the United States opens relations with Japan. And Japan is looking at what's going on in China and watching how these outside forces are dominating China. And Japan basically says, that's not going to be us. So the Tokugawa shogunate is eventually going to be disposed of. And a new effort to rebuild a new modern Japan that can control its own destiny begins. So that's ultimately the motivations of the Meiji Reform. It's to strengthen Japan in order that Japan may be able to protect itself and to advance its interests without being dominated by the Western forces the way China was. So what that means is that the government's going to change. The shogun model, the Tokugawa shogunate, is going to collapse. It's going to just fall out of favor. And in its place, we're going to have a centralized government under the emperor. So the emperor, who used to be a powerless figure, is going to become the central authority. And we're going to start seeing more of a centralized, almost like a centralized monarchy developing within Japan. And of course, they're going to model these government concepts after European models. The model that they really look to is the German model. The German model puts a great deal of central power into the Kaiser, and Japan is going to put a great deal of power into the emperor. Japan is then going to industrialize, and this is a state led, state sponsored industrial movement. And this industrialization is going to be modeled after England. The Japanese are going to send, the Japanese government will send students abroad to study the industrial models and study factories all throughout England, France, Germany, and the United States. And the Japanese government are going to bring in Western industrialists to start instructing the Japanese on how to run industries and how to run business, how to run factories. New technologies such as the steam engine starts to come in. But here's the catch is that the Japanese government welcomes Western consultants in, but they forbid Western businesses from owning Japanese factories. In other words, the Japanese factories are going to be controlled by the Japanese. They also begin to incorporate other elements of Western practices. For example, the military is going to undergo a transformation as more advanced weaponry are going to start coming in. Militaries are going to be reorganized so that they're open to all people. Promotion in the ranks is going to be based on merit as opposed to family connection and tradition. They're also going to incorporate public education. They're going to incorporate elements of Western leisure culture. They're going to start bringing in Western dress. They're going to start bringing in Western outfits. Another great example of this is the introduction of baseball. And baseball is going to become a popular game throughout Japan in the 1890s, 1900s, because it's a popular game within the United States. So Japan is going to incorporate elements of German politics, of English industry, of French society and American society, and they're going to implement what they prefer into Japan while maintaining Japanese control and elements of Japanese tradition. Now, not everybody went along with this. The samurai class. There were some samurai who went along with this, but there are other samurai who rejected this westernization because to them, this was perceived as selling out Japanese culture. And for the samurai, and this is a common theme, they're going to lose status. They're going to lose their importance in this new Western society that the Meiji reforms bring. So there are going to be rebellions all throughout Japan, particularly in the southern section. And these rebellions are going to be suppressed eventually by the emperor. By the 1870s, 1880s, Japan is industrializing rapidly. It's becoming more nationalistic with a strong central leader in the emperor at his middle. Then, of course, with industrialization comes imperialism. So Japan is going to engage in imperialism because as industrialization grows, you need markets, you need access to resources, and that's what Japan needs. So in the 1890s, Japan is going to begin a series of expansions that's going to grow the empire significantly. One expansion is in the Sino Japanese War, where Japan is going to attack China. It's going to attack China over issues in Korea and access to Korea. But the real reason is because Japan wants to access Chinese markets. And if you remember from the Chinese lecture, we talk about this idea of spheres of influence. Well, now Japan can carve out a sphere of influence in China, particularly in modern day Manchuria. But the other thing that Japan does is it picks up the island of Taiwan and it's going to push the Chinese out of Korean affairs. So, what's really happening is we're seeing a changing of the guard in Asia. China, for thousands of years, used to be the top dog of Asia. Now, Japan is exerting itself, or asserting itself, I should say, is asserting itself as the new Asian power, which is modern, which is powerful, industrial, militarily strong. So strong that they can beat China. In 1904, 1905, Japan is going to have a war with Russia. And Japan is going to defeat Russia. And for the world, this is a shock because Russia is a European nation and Japan is non European. If we go back to this idea of social Darwinism, the Europeans should be stronger than any non Europeans out there. However, Japan's victory in the Russo Japanese War shows the world just how far Japan has come as an industrial modern power. And their defeat of Russia is going to push Russia out of East Asian affairs. So think of it this way: the influence in East Asia, there's a competition between Japan and Russia. The Russo-Japanese War resolves that conflict and allows Japan to be the primary power in the area, which then brings us to the annexation of Korea. Japan in 1910 is going to annex Korea, basically making Korea part of the Japanese empire. So now Japan has expanded into Korea, and in Korea, they want Korea to be a primary food supplier. They want farmers to grow food and sell it to Japan so that Japan can support a growing population. And this is a great example of economic imperialism, where Japan is using Korean land to support the Japanese population. Japan is also going to bring in Japanese schools. They do this in Taiwan as well. They're going to bring in Japanese history, Japanese language. And that's going to have a tremendous influence on both Korea and Taiwan. And for a long time, Korea is going to resent the Japanese presence. And when after World War II, that's when Korea is going to be liberated from Japan. So we've got about 35 years where Korea is under Japanese control. So by 1910, Japan is expanding as an imperial power through East Asia. It has gone into Korea. It has taken islands in the northern Pacific off of Siberia. It's taken Taiwan. And now its eyes are going to go to Southeast Asia and South Pacific. And that's where we're going to really see the expansion leading up to and including World War II. So all of this is kind of working its way up to more recent history. So that's Japan. Now our third one is Oceania. So when I say Oceania, there's really three locales that we want to think about. One is Australia, second is New Zealand, and then the third are the Polynesian Islands. Now there are lots of Polynesian islands. So French Polynesia, for example, is a Polynesian island or a Polynesian island. Hawaii, the Fiji Islands, those are two good examples of Polynesian islands. So if you see any type of islands in the Pacific, with the possible exception of the Philippines, you can really apply a lot of what I'm about to say. So the motives. Why are the Europeans going into this region of the Pacific Ocean? Initially, in about the 1700s or so, it was all about whaling expeditions. Whaling, hunting whales, or whaling. The hunting of whales was the basis for a big industry within Europe. Whale oil that came from their blubber, that would provide fuel for kerosene lamps all throughout Europe. There is a lot of desired product out of the whale. And I mean, the whaling expeditions are going to lead to whaling settlements because, these hunters, these whalers, they need some place to stay. So they start to set up whaling villages on these islands throughout the Polynesian island chain. And this is how New Zealand gets going. Over time, what's going to happen is islands such as New Zealand and Australia are going to turn into what we call settler colonies. And these settler colonies are when mainly British immigrants are going to come in to Australia and New Zealand and start ranching and start farming. Now, of course, this is going to dramatically change those two areas because basically we have colonies by the British model getting set up. And the modern state of New Zealand and the modern state of Australia is essentially British colonies that have grown into their own countries that are based off of European culture. The other thing is that we're going to really see in the 1860s, 1870s an expansion throughout the Pacific because of the need for coaling stations or coaling stops. So if I've got steamships going across the Pacific Ocean, I need refueling stops. I need places to resupply myself. I need places to load up on coal. So islands are going to become ideal. Midway Island, for example, islands throughout the Polynesian chain. Fiji is going to be a coal station. In the Americas, Samoa, all of these islands in the Pacific are going to become places for steamships to stop and reload. And that's where you really see a big expansion throughout the Pacific. Now, of course, these European expeditions are going to have a significant impact on the natives because there are Polynesian natives living in all of these areas that the Europeans are coming into contact with. And a lot of these Polynesian natives had never interacted with the Western society. So the first effect is something that you should understand very quickly: the spread of diseases. European diseases are going to be introduced into previously isolated populations. And as a consequence, you're going to have widespread death of the natives. So much like um, the Americas, where natives come into contact with European diseases, and we have this significant decline in the population, we're going to see the same thing happen in Hawaii. We're going to see the same thing happen in New Zealand and Australia. The natives are going to come into contact with European diseases, and it's going to be decimated. Second, the Europeans are going to seek to spread Christianity to the native inhabitants. So this comes with all that social Darwinism and white man's burden. So schools are going to be set up, churches are going to be built, missionaries are going to come in, and not only are they going to introduce Christianity, but they're going to also seek to impose European practices on the natives in terms of dress, cleaning themselves, sexual relations. There's an attempt to Europeanize, if that's the right word, Europeanize or Westernize the natives. So you've got the diseases diminishing the native culture, and you've got missionaries diminishing. I'm sorry, let me start that over. You've got diseases diminishing the native population, and you've got missionaries and other educators and other people acting under white man's burden, diminishing the cultures of these native groups. And also, agriculture is going to be introduced to these parts of the world, widespread plantation based agriculture. So it's not that the Polynesians didn't know how to plant food, but they weren't doing it on a plantation level. So what's going to happen is something we saw in the Americas. Plantations are going to start growing throughout Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. And these plantations are producing cash crops for the purpose of being sold, on a global market. There, of course, is going to be resistance, military resistance from the native groups. In Australia, we refer to the native groups as Aborigines. In New Zealand, we call them the Maori, the Maori. Both of these groups are going to engage in armed conflict with British settlers as they begin to expand. So, as the British settlers begin to expand into parts of Australia, taking land, the Aborigines are going to fight back. And in the case of New Zealand, the same thing will happen. Now, what's interesting in New Zealand is that the Maori and the British settlers are going to be able to find a way to coexist in a way we don't necessarily see in Australia and the Aborigines. But even so, the British are the ones who are really taking land. They're imposing European culture, and that includes laws, education, language, everything. And native cultures are being deeply affected. The last thing I want to close on with Oceania is the example of economic imperialism in Hawaii. So, of course, we know Hawaii to be our 50th state. When the British show up in Hawaii back in the 1700s with the Cook voyages or the Cook expeditions, the British are going to be the initial settlers of Hawaii. And they're going to do all the things I just mentioned. Diseases are going to be introduced into the Hawaiian population. Um, Small tribes are going to actually unify together into a common kingdom. Kingdoms are going to start to form as a way of kind of presenting a way of checking the British expansion. British missionaries will show up and they will impact the Hawaiian culture. But then American businesses will start coming into the picture. One of those American businesses you may know as a fruit company called the Dole Company, Dole. Maybe you've heard of Dole pineapples. So Hawaii becomes a plantation paradise. Plantations for sugar, plantations for fruits such as pineapple, and there was another one that was just in my mind, bananas. They are going to start to grow all throughout Hawaii. And we'll talk more about who the plantation workers are. But for right now, all you need to know is that they are immigrants coming in from Asia, particularly from Japan. But we'll talk more about that another time. So what happens is these plantations, these American businesses are running these plantations. Now, Hawaii technically is not under American control. Hawaii is an island, has its own local governments, and the business owners are looking at the central government that's forming, saying, if we don't stop them, they're going to try and take over our land. So there's almost like a Hawaiian nationalist movement forming. And the American businesses are going to help to orchestrate an overthrow of the government in the 1890s. And then, with the turmoil that follows with that overthrow, the American business owners are going to turn to the American government and say, we need you to intervene to provide stability. And the American government is going to expand its control into Hawaii, creating it into a territory, and then eventually into the state that we have today. Which brings me to another thing about economics, or I'm sorry, about imperialism. There's a pattern that you should start to be seeing. In China, British merchants were engaged in conflict with the Chinese government. This conflict escalated to war, and the British merchants turned to the British government and said, we need help. In India, you had the East India Company, and they were engaged in business all throughout India on the behalf of Britain. But then you have the Sepoy Revolt, which threatens the business interests, and those merchants turn to the parliament and say, we need help. And in both cases, the government expands their influence and power. In the case of China, with a series of unequal treaties, and in the case of India, with outright annexation and colonization. And the same thing's happening here in Hawaii. You have the United States, you have American businessmen saying to the US Congress, we need your intervention. And the US will intervene. And that's how imperialism really does happen. Imperialism happens because governments are being brought in to protect investments that have been made by these industrial powers. So that's where we wrap it up with the three. Again, Ottoman Empire, Japan, and Oceania. The big thing I want you to understand, if I could sum this up real quick, the Ottoman Empire is falling apart. There's attempts to modernize, but those attempts kind of fall flat. Japan modernizes successfully, and they go from being an isolated medieval culture. I'm sorry, not medieval is a rough word, a feudalistic culture under the shogun, into a modern industrial empire that seeks to expand itself and engage in imperialism itself. It copies that which they like from the West. And then in the case of Oceania, we could make Oceania look a lot like the Americas, where Europe kind of comes in and dominates. And they begin to use Oceania for the purpose of supplying cash crops and ranching and mining, but more cash crops to European and American interests. And the natives of those areas are going to be quickly brought under control, even though there will be many forms of resistance. And so, as always, make sure you bring your questions to the class. And next time, what we will talk about is what will we talk? We'll talk about Africa during the age of imperialism. So, in the meantime, stay safe, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.